She had been used as a beast of burden for years, until the tables turned and everything changed. Abigail Miller had lost count of how many sacks of potatoes she had carried that morning. Her back ached so much she could barely straighten up, but she knew she couldn't stop. Silas Harrison was watching her every move from under the shadow of his straw hat, ready to shout at anything he considered slowness. "Hurry up, you lazy thing! That truck won't wait all day," he yelled, pointing his finger at the 68-year-old woman who could barely drag her feet through the dry dirt of the property. Abigail lowered her head even further. 16 years had passed since she woke up in that place, not really knowing how she had gotten there. Silas always said she showed up asking for work, that he took pity on her and let her stay in the shed behind the manor house. But something in the back of her mind always whispered that this version wasn't complete. "Sorry, Mr. Silas," she murmured, trying to quicken her step with the sack of carrots on her back. "Sorry doesn't fill bellies or pay bills," he replied, spitting on the ground. "If you can't work properly anymore, just say so and I'll find someone else. There are people in need who would be happy with what you have here." What she had there was an old mattress on the floor of a windowless shed, a bucket for her needs, and the leftovers from the Harrison family's table. Abigail knew it wasn't much, but she also knew she had nowhere to go. Her memory was like a puzzle with missing pieces. She remembered fragments: a young woman's face, the smell of cornbread, delicate hands playing the piano. But when she tried to put these memories together, they slipped away like water through her fingers. "Finish loading those vegetables and then go clean the pen," ordered Silas. "And don't forget to throw feed to the pigs. They eat better than you, but at least they're good for something." The words cut deeper than usual. Abigail had grown accustomed to the daily humiliations, but that day something different was happening in her chest. A small but present indignation was beginning to grow like a stubborn seed. The Harrison property was 15 kilometers from the nearest town, in a rural county where houses were spread out and neighbors kept their distance. It was the perfect place for no one to ask questions about an elderly woman who worked from sunup to sundown without receiving a salary, only food and shelter. Abigail finished loading the truck and headed to the pen. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she knew well the consequences of disappointing Silas. Once, 3 years ago, she had fainted from exhaustion during the corn harvest. As punishment, she went 2 days without food, only water. She had never again made the mistake of showing weakness. While cleaning the pen, she looked at the manor house where the Harrison family lived. Mrs. Beatrice, Silas's wife, was on the porch drinking coffee and flipping through a magazine. Their 2 sons, Caleb and Jacob, already adults, worked in town but returned on weekends. They always treated Abigail as if she were invisible, talking about her in the third person, even when she was present. "The old woman is getting slower," Caleb would say. "Dad should get someone younger," Jacob would reply. "She doesn't cost anything," Silas would retort. "Eats scraps and sleeps in the shed. Where do you think I'll find cheaper labor?" Abigail had overheard this conversation more than once. She knew she wasn't considered a person, just a useful tool. But that day, as she removed manure with the old broken hoe, she wondered for the first time in years, what if there was something different for her somewhere? The rain began to fall in the late afternoon. Abigail ran to the shed, soaked and shivering from the cold. The old structure had leaks on all sides, and she had to place buckets and old pots to catch the water falling from the ceiling. That's when she noticed something strange. The heavy rain had washed away some of the dirt in the corner of the shed, revealing something that looked like paper or plastic buried there. Abigail looked around to make sure she was alone and began to dig with her hands. Her fingers found what seemed to be a plastic bag buried long ago. Inside the bag were old yellowed papers, but protected from the moisture. Abigail took the documents with trembling hands and tried to understand what was written. The letters danced before her eyes. She had never learned to read properly, only recognizing a few scattered words, but there was something familiar about those papers. A name she could slowly spell out. Abigail. It was her name. Her heart began to beat faster. Why would her name be on papers buried in the floor of the shed where she lived? Abigail quickly hid the documents under her mattress when she heard footsteps approaching. It was Silas coming to give his orders for dinner. "Stop standing there like a statue," he shouted from the doorway. "Go to the kitchen to get your food and then get out of my sight." She obeyed, as always, but her mind was buzzing with questions. During the night, lying on the damp mattress, Abigail took out the papers again and tried to understand what they meant. There were numbers, stamps, signatures. Everything seemed very official and important. The next morning, Abigail woke before sunrise as usual. Her tasks began at 5 in the morning and ended after 8 at night. But while preparing the animals' feed, her mind was occupied with the mysterious papers. It was during the employer's breakfast that she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "Are you sure she won't remember anything?" "Mrs." Beatrice asked in a low voice. "It's been 16 years, woman," Silas replied. "If she were going to remember, she would have by now. Besides, who's going to believe the word of a crazy old woman against ours? But what if someone comes looking for her? Who? She has no one else in the world. And officially she doesn't even exist anymore. It was all settled a long time ago." Abigail felt as if someone had thrown ice water down her back. They were talking about her. But what did it all mean? What was she supposed to remember? And why did she no longer exist officially? The rest of the day passed in a fog of confusion and fear. Abigail performed her tasks automatically, but her mind couldn't focus on anything else. That night she examined the papers again more carefully. There was something written in large letters that she could partially decipher. Rural property. Her heart raced. Could it be that those papers had something to do with land, with property? But why would they be buried in the shed where she lived? The following week, on market day in town, Abigail had an opportunity that hadn't come up in months. Silas had gone to take care of business at the bank and left her in charge of selling the vegetables in the square. It was a responsibility he only gave her when he had no other choice. That's when she saw a young teacher approach the stall. The young woman was about 25, with brown hair tied in a ponytail and delicate framed glasses. Her name was Eleanor Thompson, and she taught at the rural school in the county. "Good morning, ma'am," said Eleanor with a kind smile. "How much for a kilo of potatoes?" $2, miss," replied Abigail, avoiding looking directly at the teacher. Eleanor noticed something strange in the elderly woman's posture. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, as if she carried an invisible weight on her shoulders. "Are you all right?" Eleanor asked with genuine concern. Abigail quickly raised her eyes and then lowered them again. "Yes, I am, dear. Just tired." "Have you been working with these vegetables for a long time?" "I've worked for the Harrison family for many years," replied Abigail, choosing her words carefully. Eleanor knew the Harrison family by sight. She knew they owned several properties in the county and had a reputation for being difficult people to deal with. But something in Abigail's manner of speaking piqued her curiosity. "Do you live there on the property?" "Yes, I do. In the shed behind the house." The answer made Eleanor stop. In the shed? Why would an employee live in a shed? And why did that woman seem afraid to even talk? "Ma'am, sorry for asking, but do you receive a salary for your work?" Abigail looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might hear her. "I receive food and a place to sleep. It's enough." Eleanor felt a pang of indignation. That situation didn't seem normal. An elderly woman working in exchange only for food and sleeping in a shed. That sounded like exploitation. "What is your name?" "Abigail. Abigail Miller." "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Abigail. My name is Eleanor. I'm a teacher here in the county." It was at that moment that Silas appeared, coming from the bank with a scowling expression. "What's taking so long to sell these vegetables?" he shouted, startling both Abigail and Eleanor. "Sorry, Mr. Silas," murmured Abigail. "The young lady was asking the price." Silas looked Eleanor up and down suspiciously. "And you? What do you want here?" "I was just buying vegetables," replied Eleanor, trying to keep her voice firm. "Then buy and leave quickly. No time for chatting with the help." Eleanor bought 2 kilos of potatoes and a dozen oranges, but her hands trembled with anger. The way Silas treated Abigail was humiliating and inhumane. "You can keep the change," she said, handing over a $20 bill for a purchase that cost $12. Abigail looked surprised at the money, but Silas was faster. "What change?" he said, taking the bill from Abigail's hand. "She doesn't need money. I manage everything for her." Eleanor left the market with a heavy heart. Throughout the following week, she couldn't get the image of Abigail out of her head. There was something deeply wrong with that situation. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out, now continuing. Determined to find out more about the situation, Eleanor began asking discreet questions in town. She discovered that Abigail Miller had appeared at the Harrison property many years ago, but no one knew exactly how or when. Some older people remembered her from before, but their memories were vague and contradictory. "She was different before," said Mrs. Pearl, the owner of the local grocery store. "More proud, you know. She spoke differently, too. After she went to work for the Harrisons, she became all hunched over and quiet." "Work?" asked Eleanor. "Or was she always their employee?" "I can't tell you that, dear. It was so long ago. But I have the impression she used to live somewhere else around here." The information was confusing, but Eleanor decided to try a different approach. The following week, she returned to the Harrison property with the excuse of wanting to buy vegetables directly from the grower for the school. Abigail was in the backyard hanging clothes when Eleanor arrived. The elderly woman seemed even more worn down than the last time. "Mrs. Abigail, good morning," Eleanor said quietly. "Oh, the teacher," replied Abigail, looking nervously toward the manor house. "What do you want here?" "I wanted to talk with you, if possible." "Talk about what?" "I don't know anything, miss." Eleanor noticed the fear in Abigail's voice and decided to be more direct. "Mrs. Abigail, I'm not one to judge other people's lives, but it seems to me that you're not being treated as you should be here." Abigail stopped hanging the clothes and looked directly at Eleanor for the first time. "And what do you know about how I should be treated?" "I know that every person deserves dignity, respect, and a fair wage for their work." The words touched something deep within Abigail. For years, no one had spoken to her about dignity or respect. "You're too young to understand certain things in life," said Abigail, but her voice had lost some of its harshness. "Perhaps I am, but I know how to recognize when someone is suffering." Abigail felt her eyes fill with tears. It had been so long since anyone had shown genuine concern for her that she had forgotten what it felt like. "I can't talk about these things," she whispered. "If your Mr. Silas hears—" "He's not here now, and I promise I won't tell anyone what we talk about." Abigail looked around once more and then did something she hadn't done in years. She trusted someone. "Teacher, I think there's something wrong with me. I have confusing memories, like they're dreams, and I found some papers buried in the shed where I sleep." Eleanor felt her heart race. Buried papers? That sounded very suspicious. "What kind of papers, Mrs. Abigail?" "I can't say. I don't really know how to read. But my name is on them." "Would you like me to take a look at those papers?" Abigail hesitated. Trusting Eleanor meant risking everything. If Silas found out, the consequences would be terrible. "If you want, I can come back here one night when everyone is asleep," suggested Eleanor. "No one needs to know." And so began a secret friendship between the young teacher and the exploited elderly woman. 3 nights later, Eleanor returned to the property and found Abigail waiting in the shed. What Eleanor saw shocked her deeply. The place where Abigail lived wasn't even fit for animals. There was no bed, just an old dirty mattress on the floor. There was no bathroom, just a bucket in the corner. The walls were made of old wood with holes that let in wind and rain. "My God, Mrs. Abigail," murmured Eleanor. "How long have you lived here?" 16 years, replied Abigail, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Eleanor felt nauseous. How could a family keep a person in such inhumane conditions for so long? "Where are the papers you found?" Abigail carefully took the documents out from inside an old can under the mattress. Eleanor took the yellowed papers and began to examine them under the dim light of a flashlight. What she saw left her speechless. The first document was a birth certificate in the name of Abigail Miller, born March 15, 1955. The second was a marriage certificate showing she had married Samuel Miller in 1978. The third document made Eleanor's blood run cold. It was a deed for rural property in the name of Abigail Miller, registered at the county clerk's office in 1995. "Mrs. Abigail," said Eleanor, her voice trembling, "are you married?" "Married?" Abigail seemed confused. I don't know. Sometimes I dream of a man with dark hair, but I don't know if it's real or my imagination. And about this property here in the document, do you remember anything?" Abigail took the paper in her hands and stared at it for a long time. "There's a strange thing," she said slowly. "Sometimes, when I'm working the land, I feel like I know every little piece of it, like I've planted there before, you know?" Eleanor was beginning to form a terrible theory in her mind. What if Abigail wasn't just an exploited worker? What if she was, in fact, the true owner of that land? "Mrs. Abigail, do you remember how you arrived here at the Harrison property?" "Mr. Silas always tells me that I showed up here asking for work, all disheveled and with nowhere to stay, that he took pity on me and gave me a chance." "And do you believe that version?" Abigail fell silent for a long time. "You know what's strange, Professor? I don't remember arriving here. I don't remember asking for work. I don't remember anything from the first few months. It's as if I woke up one day, already living in the shed and working in the fields." Abigail's words confirmed Helena's suspicions. Something very serious had happened 16 years ago, and she was determined to discover what. "Mrs. Abigail, I will help you discover the truth about these documents, but I need you to trust me and not tell anyone about our conversation." "I trust you, Professor. It's been so long since anyone has been kind to me that I had forgotten how good it feels." Helena left the property that night with the documents in her bag and a clear mission: to discover who Abigail Miller really was and what had happened to her 16 years ago. The next day, Helena went to the town's records office with the original documents. The clerk, Mr. Elias Fletcher, examined the papers carefully. "These documents are legitimate," he confirmed. "This deed shows that Abigail Miller is the owner of a 150-hectare farm in the rural county." "Where exactly is this property located?" asked Helena. Mr. Elias consulted the cadastral map. "According to the description here, it's on Green Hill Road, kilometer 15. It's a large property with a manor house, sheds, and a considerable cultivation area." Helena felt her stomach turn. That description matched exactly the property where the Harrisons lived and where Abigail worked as a slave. "Does this name, Abigail Miller, appear in any other records here at the office?" Mr. Elias did a search in the system. "Yes, it does. She is also the owner of 2 smaller properties in the region, one of 20 hectares and another of 8 hectares, all registered between 1995 and 2003. Helena was stunned. Abigail wasn't just the owner of one piece of land, but of 3 properties in the region, and she was being kept as a slave on her own land by the Harrisons. "Mr. Elias, is there any record of sale for these properties?" "Let me check." "No, there are no records of sale. Officially, all properties still belong to Abigail Miller." "And is there any record of power of attorney or transfer of management?" "I don't find anything like that either. Legally, she remains the sole owner and manager of all the land." Helena left the records office certain that she had discovered one of the cruelest crimes she had ever witnessed. The Harrisons weren't just exploiting Abigail, they had seized her properties and kept her captive so she couldn't claim her rights. But how to prove it? How to help a woman with fragmented memory recover her identity and her estate? Helena decided she needed more information. She spent the afternoon at the municipal library researching old newspaper archives. It was in the issues from 16 years ago that she found the clue she was looking for. On the police page of a local newspaper dated March 2007, she found a small note: "Woman disappears after accident on rural road." Abigail Miller, 52 years old, landowner, was not found after a car accident on Green Hill Road. Vehicle was located in a ravine, but occupant was not found. Family asks for information. The puzzle began to form in Helena's mind. Abigail had suffered an accident 16 years ago and disappeared. Somehow the Harrisons found her injured and took advantage of her vulnerable condition to seize her land. But Eleanor needed more evidence before confronting the criminals. She decided to look for information about Abigail's family. If she had been married to Samuel Miller, where was he? Why hadn't he searched for his missing wife? The answer came at the municipal cemetery. Samuel Miller's tombstone showed he had passed away in January 2007, just 2 months before Abigail's accident. The cause of death, according to the cemetery worker, had been a heart attack. Eleanor began to understand the chronology of events. Samuel Miller died in early 2007, leaving Abigail a widow and alone. 2 months later, she had the accident and disappeared. The Harrisons, likely aware of her vulnerable situation, seized the opportunity to take possession of her lands. But there were still pieces missing from the puzzle. How did the Harrisons manage the properties without legal documentation? How did no one notice that the true owner was being kept as a slave on her own land? Eleanor decided to investigate the Harrison family's business dealings more deeply. She discovered they had prospered significantly over the last 15 years, acquiring expensive equipment and renovating the manor house. All that money had come from exploiting Abigail's land. It was time to speak with the true owner again and help her recover her memory and her rights. The following night, Eleanor returned to the shed where Abigail lived. She brought with her copies of all the documents she had found and some old photographs she managed to get from the town hall archives. "Mrs. Abigail, I need to show you some things." Abigail was visibly nervous. During the day, Silas had shouted more than usual and even threatened to replace her with someone younger and more efficient. "What did you find, teacher?" Eleanor took a deep breath. How do you tell someone they've been the victim of one of the cruelest schemes she had ever witnessed? "Mrs. Abigail, do you remember the name Samuel Miller?" The effect was immediate. Abigail's face transformed, as if a light had turned on in her eyes. "Samuel," she whispered. "I dream of that name. A tall man, with dark hair, a gentle smile." "That man was your husband, Mrs. Abigail. You were married for almost 30 years. Tears began to stream down Abigail's face. "Husband? I was married. But where is he?" Eleanor held the elderly woman's hands. "He passed away in January 2007, Mrs. Abigail, and 2 months later you were in a car accident and disappeared." "Accident?" Abigail brought her hand to her forehead. "Sometimes I get terrible headaches, as if something had hurt me here. Mrs. Abigail, I need you to try to remember. This land we are on now, it does not belong to the Harrisons. It is yours. It has always been yours." Eleanor's words echoed in the shed like thunder. Abigail fell silent for a long time, processing the information. "Mine? How can it be mine if I live here like a slave?" Eleanor completed. "That is exactly what the Harrisons did to you. They took advantage of your condition after the accident to steal your land and your dignity." Abigail began to tremble, not from cold, but from a rage that had lain dormant for 16 years. "They stole everything from me?" "Not just this property. You own 3 plots of land in the county, totaling more than 170 acres. The Harrisons have been profiting from your property for 16 years, while keeping you in inhumane conditions." The revelation was like an earthquake in Abigail's mind. Fragments of memory began to rearrange themselves. She remembered plans to expand the corn planting. She remembered conversations with Samuel about buying more cattle. She remembered feeling proud of having built a solid legacy with the work of her own hands. "I remember some things now," she said. Her voice choked. "I remember planting that mango tree near the manor house. I remember choosing the spot to build the equipment shed. And do you remember how you came to live in your current condition?" Abigail closed her eyes and tried to pierce the fog that shrouded her memories. "It's all very confusing. I remember a headache, not being able to walk properly. Silas saying I had no family, that I had nowhere to live. He seemed to be the only person who cared about me. But now you know that was a lie. He never cared. He saw an opportunity to take your land and seized it." Abigail's anger grew with each minute. 16 years of humiliation, of relentless work, of being treated worse than an animal, all while working on her own land, supporting the family that had stolen everything from her. What can I do, Miss Eleanor? How can I prove all this is true? First, we need to gather all the evidence. Then, we'll look for a lawyer. And most importantly, we need to help you recover your memory completely. Eleanor spent the rest of the evening showing old documents and photographs to Abigail. With each new piece of information, more memory fragments returned. Abigail began to remember specific details about her properties, about her plans, about the life she had before the accident. I remember now a conversation I had with Samuel a few days before he passed away, said Abigail. He was worried about something. Said he didn't trust the neighbors, that they were paying too much attention to our business. Which neighbors? The Harrisons. Samuel said Silas asked too many questions about our land, about our plans. He even suggested we change the will, make everything clearer on paper. Eleanor felt a chill down her spine. Samuel Miller had sensed the Harrisons' intentions before he died. Had he lived a few more months, perhaps he could have protected his wife from the scheme that was coming. Mrs. Abigail, do you remember the accident? Not much. I remember I was coming back from town. I was very sad because I had gone to settle the paperwork for Samuel's burial. It was raining hard. The road was slippery. Abigail stopped talking and brought her hands to her head. It hurts a lot when I try to remember that part. Don't force it, Mrs. Abigail. The memory will come back little by little. But Eleanor was intrigued. If Abigail had suffered an accident on the road, how did she end up exactly on the Harrisons' property? It was too big a coincidence to be believable. Mrs. Abigail, do you remember where you were found after the accident? Silas always told me he found me by the side of the road, all hurt and confused. He said he took me to the hospital, and then when I had nowhere to stay, he offered me work and a place to live. And do you believe that story? Abigail became thoughtful. Now that you're asking me these questions, I realize I never questioned that story. But it's strange, isn't it? If I was the owner of large lands, why would I have nowhere to stay? Eleanor was becoming increasingly convinced that Abigail's accident had not been random. The Harrisons knew exactly who she was when they found her. They planned everything carefully. Mrs. Abigail, I'm going to investigate this accident story further. But for now, I need you to continue your life here as normal. We can't let the Harrisons suspect we've discovered the truth. I don't know if I'll be able to keep pretending I know nothing, Miss Eleanor. Every time Silas yells at me, I'll want to yell back that he's a thief. I know it's hard, but it's important for our strategy. We need to gather all the evidence before we act. Abigail agreed, but Eleanor could see it would be difficult for her to keep up the act. 16 years of forced submission had come to an end. Now that she knew the truth, it would be impossible to return to ignorance. The next morning, Eleanor went to the town library to research more about Abigail's accident. In the archives of the company responsible for the tow truck at the time, she found the vehicle recovery report. Abigail's car had been found on an embankment on Green Hill Road, exactly at kilometer 12, 3 kilometers before the entrance to the Harrison property. The report mentioned there were no signs of the occupant at the accident site, but there were blood trails leading away from the vehicle. Eleanor studied the map of the area carefully. It was physically impossible for Abigail, injured in an accident at kilometer 12, to have walked alone to the Harrison property at kilometer 15, especially considering she had suffered a head trauma severe enough to cause memory loss. The conclusion was inevitable. The Harrisons had removed Abigail from the accident site. They probably found her unconscious or semi-conscious, and instead of taking her to the hospital as decent people would, decided to seize the opportunity to execute a plan they might have been plotting since Samuel Miller's death. Eleanor needed more evidence. She decided to look for the doctor who had treated accident cases at the time. Dr. Arthur Bennett was still practicing in town, now over 70 years old. "Yes, I remember that case," said Dr. Arthur when Eleanor mentioned the 2007 accident. "It was very strange. Silas Harrison brought the woman saying she had fainted on his property. She had clear signs of head trauma, but he insisted it was from a fall, not a car accident. Did you believe that version?" "At the time, I had no reason to be suspicious, but it always seemed odd to me that a fall would cause such specific injuries. And there was something else?" "What else, Doctor?" "The woman had signs of having worn nicer clothes. The marks on her wrist indicated she habitually wore an expensive watch. Her hands showed she wasn't used to heavy labor. It didn't match what Silas said about her being a poor farm worker. Eleanor's suspicions were increasingly confirmed. Dr. Arthur had noticed inconsistencies in the story from the beginning, but with no reason to suspect a crime, he had treated Abigail and released her into Silas's care. "Doctor, did you follow up on the patient's recovery?" "No. Silas said she was fine, that her memory was coming back slowly. I never saw her again after that." Eleanor thanked the doctor and left with another important piece of the puzzle. Now she was certain there was enough evidence to prove the Harrisons had committed an elaborate crime that had continued for 16 years, but she still needed legal help to know how to proceed. Eleanor knew Mr. Scott Sterling, a retired lawyer who lived in the neighboring town and had a reputation for being an upright and competent person. Mr. Sterling listened to Eleanor's entire story with growing indignation. "This is one of the most appalling cases I've ever heard," he said. "We have here embezzlement, false imprisonment, exploitation of labor akin to slavery, falsification of documents. The list of crimes is long." "What can we do, Mr. Sterling?" "First, we need Abigail to undergo a complete medical examination to document her current condition. Then, we go to the notary's office to file a report of fraud, and we need to gather all possible witnesses. People who knew Abigail before the accident and who could confirm her true identity. Neighbors, suppliers, anyone who had contact with her when she was the true owner of the land." Eleanor spent the following days searching for people who could testify on Abigail's behalf. It was a more difficult task than she expected. Many people had moved away from the county, others had passed away, and some simply didn't want to get involved. But she managed to find 3 important witnesses: Mrs. Daisy, who had been Abigail and Samuel's neighbor for over 10 years, Mr. Thomas, who had sold cattle to the couple in the 90s, and Robert, a mechanic who had repaired Abigail's tractor several times before the accident. All these people confirmed that Abigail Miller was a prosperous and independent woman before 2007. Mrs. Daisy even had a photograph of the couple at a harvest festival in 2005, where Abigail appeared well-dressed and smiling, completely different from the hunched and sad woman who worked as a slave for the Harrisons. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out now continuing. While Eleanor gathered evidence, Abigail fought to maintain normality in her daily routine. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to accept Silas's humiliations without reacting. Her posture began to change subtly, and this did not go unnoticed. "What's going on with you?" asked Silas one morning, after Abigail didn't immediately lower her head when he yelled. "Getting bold now?" "No, sir," replied Abigail, but her voice no longer had the same submissive tone as before. "You better remember your place here," said Silas, approaching her threateningly. "Without me, you're nothing. Without me, you'd be dead in the street." For the first time in 16 years, Abigail looked directly into Silas's eyes as she responded, "I know very well what my place is." The answer surprised Silas so much that he was left speechless for a few seconds. There was something different in Abigail's voice, a firmness he had never heard before. That night Silas talked to his wife about his observations. "Beatrice, I think the old woman is going crazy. Today she looked at me strangely, as if she knew something." "Know what, Silas? She's practically illiterate and has no contact with anyone. What could she possibly know?" "I don't know, but something has changed. She's different." "You're being paranoid. She's getting older. Maybe she has some health problem. If she's bothering you so much, we can get rid of her and find someone else." "It's not that simple," replied Silas, and there was a tension in his voice that Beatrice couldn't interpret. Silas had reasons to be worried that his wife didn't fully know. Beatrice knew they had taken Abigail's land, but she didn't know all the details about how it had happened. She believed Silas's version that Abigail had shown up asking for work and that they had merely taken advantage of using her abandoned land. The truth was much more sinister. Silas had planned everything meticulously since Samuel Miller's death. He knew Abigail would be vulnerable and had waited for the perfect opportunity to act. On the night of the accident, Silas hadn't found Abigail by chance. He had followed her car down the dark, rainy road. When she lost control of the vehicle on the dangerous curve, he was the first to arrive at the scene. Instead of calling for help, he loaded the unconscious Abigail into his pickup truck and took her to his property. During the first weeks after the accident, while Abigail recovered from her physical injuries but struggled with memory loss, Silas had worked to erase all traces of her true identity. He hid important documents, spread the story that she was a worker with no family, and gradually conditioned her to accept her new reality of servitude. Now, 16 years later, Silas felt his house of cards could collapse. Abigail's change in attitude worried him deeply. If she were regaining her memory, all would be lost. The next morning, Silas decided to test his suspicions. He called Abigail for a private conversation. "Sit here," he ordered, pointing to an old chair on the porch of the manor house. Abigail obeyed, but for the first time in years, she sat up straight, not hunched over as usual. "Do you remember how you got here?" asked Silas, watching her reaction closely. "I remember what you've always told me," Abigail answered carefully. "And what have I always told you?" "That I showed up here asking for work, that you took pity on me and gave me a chance." Silas noticed something in the way she spoke. There was a subtle hesitation, as if she were reciting rehearsed words. "And you believe that?" The question caught Abigail by surprise. Why was Silas questioning his own version of the story? "I have always believed what you told me." "Have always believed," Silas repeated. Interesting choice of words. "And now, do you still believe?" Abigail realized she had made a mistake. Silas was suspicious, testing her. She needed to be more careful. "Of course I believe, Mr. Silas. Why would I doubt?" "I don't know," he said, standing up and walking around the chair where she sat. "But you've been acting different, talking different, even carrying yourself different." "I haven't changed anything, sir." "Oh, no? Then why did you look me in the eye yesterday when I spoke to you? In 16 years, you had never done that." Abigail felt her heart race. Silas had noticed even small details like that. "It wasn't for any special reason, Mr. Silas. Perhaps I was distracted." "Distracted by what? You have nothing to be distracted by here." The conversation was becoming dangerous. Abigail could feel the suspicion growing in Silas's eyes. "I can't explain it, sir. Perhaps it's just my age catching up to me." Silas stopped in front of her and leaned in, putting his face very close to hers. "Listen well, you old woman," he said in a low, threatening voice. "I don't know what's going on in your head, but you'd better forget any strange ideas you might have had. You are nobody. You have nothing. You only exist because I allow it. And if I decide you're no longer useful here, you'll disappear so completely that no one will even remember you existed." The words were like slaps to Abigail's face. She realized Silas knew much more about her situation than he had previously admitted. The threats were too specific to be casual. "I understand, Mr. Silas," she said, forcing her voice back into its usual submissive tone. "I hope you do," he replied, stepping back, "because there won't be a second chance." Abigail left the conversation with Silas more determined than ever to recover her stolen life. But she was also frightened. If he was capable of making her disappear completely, as he had threatened, Eleanor might be in danger too. That night, when Eleanor came to visit her secretly, Abigail told her about the conversation with Silas. "He knows, teacher. He knows that I know something." "Calm down, Mrs. Abigail. This was to be expected. When someone changes after 16 years of doing the same thing, it's natural for it to be noticed. But he threatened me, said he could make me disappear if he wanted to." Eleanor felt a chill down her spine. The threats confirmed that the Harrisons were more dangerous than she had imagined. "Mrs. Abigail, I think the time has come for us to act more quickly. We cannot wait any longer." "What do you mean?" "Let's go see Mr. Sterling tomorrow and start the legal process. We have enough evidence. What if it goes wrong? What if we can't prove anything?" "It will work," said Eleanor with a determination she didn't fully feel. "The truth is on our side." The next day, Eleanor missed work at the school and took Abigail to the nearest town, where Mr. Sterling kept a small home office. The retired lawyer examined all the documents and listened carefully to the two women's account. "We have a solid case," confirmed Mr. Sterling. "But I'll be honest with you, it will be a difficult battle. The Harrisons will hire expensive lawyers and will try to discredit Abigail by arguing mental instability. Can they do that? Asked Eleanor. They can try. That's why it's important for Abigail to undergo medical and psychological exams immediately. We need to prove she is mentally capable and that her memories are true, not delusions. Mr. Sterling scheduled the exams for the following week and began preparing the legal documentation, but he warned that the process would be long and complex. You need to be prepared for a war, he said. The Harrisons won't easily give up such a large estate. Abigail returned to the property that afternoon with a mix of hope and terror in her heart. For the first time in 16 years, there was a real possibility of getting her life back, but she also knew she was entering the most dangerous phase of the whole situation. Silas immediately noticed she had left the property. Abigail had tried to be discreet, but he knew her every movement after so many years. "Where did you go today?" he asked as soon as she returned. Abigail had prepared an answer. "I went to gather firewood in the woods, Mr. Silas. Mrs. Beatrice asked me to collect more wood for the stove." "What woods? You didn't bring any firewood." Abigail realized she had made a mistake. In her hurry to invent an excuse, she hadn't thought of the details. "I didn't find any good wood. It was all wet from yesterday's rain." Silas didn't believe the explanation, but decided not to confront her directly at that moment. Instead, he made a decision that made Abigail's blood run cold. He decided to lock her in the shed at night. "Starting today you will sleep with the door locked," he announced, "for your own safety. There have been a lot of vagrants wandering the county lately." Abigail knew this wasn't about protection, but imprisonment. Silas was preventing her from leaving the shed during the night. This meant Eleanor could no longer visit her secretly. On the first night locked in, Abigail felt more like a prisoner than ever, but also more determined. If Silas was taking extreme measures, it meant he had a lot to lose. This confirmed she was on the right path. Eleanor realized something was wrong when she couldn't enter the shed as usual. She saw the new chain on the door and understood that the Harrisons had discovered her visits, or at least suspected them. She decided to take a riskier approach. The next morning, she went directly to the Harrison property and knocked on the door of the manor house. Beatrice answered, surprised to see the young teacher there. "What do you want here?" "I came to speak with Mr. Silas about a school project," lied Eleanor. "We want to take the children on an educational visit to learn about farm work." "Silas isn't here now," Beatrice replied curtly, "and he doesn't much care for unannounced visits." Eleanor pretended to accept the information, but used the opportunity to observe the activity on the property. She saw Abigail working in the yard, but the distance was too great for any communication. "Then I'll come back another day," said Eleanor. "Could you let her know I was here?" "I can," replied Beatrice, closing the door without ceremony. Eleanor knew her visit would be reported to Silas and that this could complicate Abigail's situation even further. But she needed to find a way to maintain contact. The solution came through an indirect strategy. Eleanor hired Robert, the mechanic who had known Abigail before the accident, to do a job on the Harrison property. Silas needed repairs on one of the electrified fences, and Robert had the reputation of being the best rural electrician in the county. During the job, Robert managed to speak briefly with Abigail without raising suspicion. "Mrs. Abigail, the teacher Eleanor says to tell you everything is moving along well," he whispered, while pretending to examine an electrical wire near where she was working. "Tell her I'm being watched," Abigail replied in a low voice. "They lock me in the shed at night. She wants you to know that important things are going to happen next week, for you to be prepared." Robert's information brought renewed hope to Abigail, but it also increased her anxiety. If important things were going to happen next week, it meant the situation would reach its climax very soon. During the weekend, Silas's two sons returned to the property. Caleb and Jacob were already middle-aged men, both working in businesses in the city, but they always participated in important family decisions. Abigail noticed serious conversations happening in the manor house. The voices were always low, but the tone was tense and worried. She suspected Silas had shared his suspicions with his sons. Her suspicion was confirmed when Jacob approached her on Sunday morning. "You," he said, pointing at Abigail, "come here." Abigail approached, trying to appear submissive as always, My father says you've been acting strange lately. Is that true? I don't know what you mean. Don't play dumb. You know exactly what I mean. Jacob was different from Silas. While the father used shouting and intimidation, the son had a more calculated and cold way of threatening. If you're thinking of doing something stupid, you'd better forget it real quick, he continued. This family has invested a lot of time and money taking care of you. If you cause any trouble, we'll collect every penny back. Jacob's words revealed something important. They hadn't just stolen Abigail's properties. They were prepared to use financial arguments to justify exploiting her. I've never caused trouble for anyone, Abigail replied carefully. And it's better if it stays that way, because if we find out you've been talking to strangers or making up stories, the consequences will be very serious. The threat was clear. The Harrisons knew about Eleanor, or at least suspected some outside contact. Abigail spent the rest of Sunday discreetly observing the family's behavior. She noticed they were more tense than usual, talking in small groups and always stopping when she approached. At night, locked again in the shed, she heard voices coming from the manor house. The window of one of the bedrooms was open, and the wind carried fragments of the conversation. We can't let this continue. If she remembers anything. 16 years was enough time. Maybe it's time to settle this for good. The words reached Abigail's ears incomplete, but enough to fill her with terror. What did settle this for good mean? On Monday morning, Eleanor took Abigail to undergo the medical exams Mr. Sterling had requested. This time she used a different strategy to get her off the property without raising suspicion. Eleanor had arranged with Mrs. Daisy, Abigail's former neighbor, to pretend she needed to hire a cleaning lady for a deep clean. Mrs. Daisy went to the Harrison property and asked to borrow Abigail for a few hours. Silas hesitated, but Mrs. Daisy was a respected person in the county, and he didn't want to seem overly possessive of his employee. Just for today, he said, and I want her back before 5 in the afternoon. The medical exams revealed that Abigail was in poor physical condition due to years of hard labor and poor nutrition, but mentally she was completely lucid. The psychologist confirmed that her recovered memories were consistent and true, not delusions or inventions. Mr. Sterling used the medical reports to finalize the initial petition that would be filed at the courthouse the next morning. The document requested the recognition of Abigail Miller's true identity and the immediate restitution of her properties. Tomorrow we begin officially, said Mr. Sterling. From the moment we file this petition, the Harrisons will be notified and will have to respond to the accusations. Will they know it was Abigail who reported them? Asked Eleanor. Inevitably. That's why it's important that she does not return to the property after today. The information took Abigail by surprise. Not go back, but where will I stay? You can stay at my house, offered Eleanor, at least until we resolve the legal situation. And if they come looking for me there? That's why we will also file a request for a protective order, explained Mr. Sterling. The Harrisons will be prohibited from approaching you. Abigail looked out the window of Mr. Sterling's office toward the mountains where the property that had been hers for so many years was located, and which she now discovered was still legally hers to this day. After 16 years living as a slave on my own land, she said with a firm voice, the time has come to be the mistress of my own life again. That was the last night Abigail Miller spent as a prisoner. The next morning, she would be officially recognized as a victim of one of the cruelest crimes the county had ever witnessed. But the Harrisons would not give up without a fight, and the battle for justice was just beginning. On Tuesday morning, Mr. Sterling filed the petition at the neighboring town's courthouse. The judge, Judge William Vance, known for his seriousness and impartiality, quickly analyzed the case and ordered immediate measures. The Harrisons were officially notified of the accusations and summoned to appear at a hearing within 15 days. Furthermore, the requested protective order was granted, prohibiting any member of the family from approaching Abigail. The news spread through the county like wildfire. Within hours, everyone knew that the woman who had worked as a slave for the Harrisons was actually the owner of all the land they had lived on and profited from for 16 years. Silas's reaction was explosive. When he received the court summons, he smashed furniture in the manor house's living room and shouted threats that were heard by the nearest neighbors. "That crazy woman will regret messing with me," he yelled for anyone to hear. Beatrice tried to calm her husband, but she herself was in a panic. If they lost the properties, the Harrison family would be reduced to poverty instantly. Everything they had built over the last 16 years would crumble. "Silas, are you sure there isn't any document that proves the land is ours?" she asked desperately. "There is no document because the land was never ours," he answered angrily. "I thought she would never remember anything. 16 years passed without a single problem." It was the first time Beatrice had heard from her own husband the complete confirmation that they had stolen the properties. Until then, she had partially believed the version that Abigail had abandoned the lands and they had merely taken advantage of them. "So, everything we have really belongs to her?" asked Beatrice in a weak voice. "Everything," confirmed Silas. "Every hectare, every building, every animal, everything is legally in her name." The scale of what had happened began to form in Beatrice's mind. They hadn't just exploited an employee. They had held the true owner of everything captive while enriching themselves with her estate. Caleb and Jacob were called back to the property with urgency. When they learned the full details of the situation, they were horrified not only by the legal implications, but by the moral scale of the crime their father had committed. "Father, do you realize this could send us all to prison?" said Caleb, always the more pragmatic of the two. "No one is going to any prison if we act fast," replied Silas. "First, we'll hire the best lawyer money can buy. Second, we'll prove the old woman is crazy and making all this up." "How are we going to prove she's crazy if she has all the original documents?" asked Jacob. "We'll say she stole the documents, that she broke into the house and stole old papers to invent this story." Silas's strategy was desperate and improvised, but it was all he had. During the following days, the family worked feverishly to build a defense. They hired Mr. Harold Blackwell, a lawyer known for taking difficult cases and using questionable tactics to win. Mr. Blackwell examined the situation and was honest about their chances of success. "You know the evidence is all against you, right?" he said during the first meeting. "Her documents are legitimate. There are witnesses who confirm her identity, and medical exams prove she is mentally sound." "So there's nothing we can do?" asked Beatrice. "I didn't say that, but we're going to have to get creative." Mr. Blackwell's strategy was to question the validity of Abigail's recovered memories, argue that 16 years was enough time to establish ownership by adverse possession, and try to discredit the witnesses. While the Harrisons planned their defense, Abigail was experiencing something completely new, being treated with dignity and respect. Eleanor had prepared a comfortable room in her house with a soft bed, clean clothes, and abundant food. For the first time in 16 years, Abigail slept without fear, ate until she was full and could take a hot bath whenever she wanted. The physical transformation was remarkable. In just 1 week away from the slave labor and poor diet, Abigail began to straighten up. Her hunched back began to assume a more upright posture, her face gained color, and her eyes regained the sparkle they had lost. But the emotional transformation was even more striking. Abigail began to talk about plans for the future, about things she wanted to do when she recovered her properties. The submissive and hopeless woman was disappearing, revealing the strong and determined person who had built a considerable estate before the accident. "You know what I want to do most when all this is over," she said to Eleanor one afternoon as they had tea on the porch. "What, Mrs. Abigail?" "I want to plant a flower garden right in front of the manor house. All these years, I could only plant what made a profit for them. I could never plant anything just for beauty." The words touched Eleanor deeply. Even in Abigail's simplest dreams, there was poetry and hope. Mr. Sterling visited daily to follow the development of the case. He had secured more witnesses and was building a solid argument for the hearing. "Mrs. Abigail, I want you to be prepared for difficult questions at the hearing," he said. "The Harrisons' lawyer will try to confuse you, will question your memories, will try to make you seem confused or incapable." "I am prepared," Abigail replied with a firmness that surprised everyone. 16 years of humiliation have prepared me for anything they can do now." The hearing date was set for a Monday, 2 weeks after the initial petition was filed. During these days of preparation, more sordid details about the Harrisons' crime began to emerge. Eleanor discovered they had forged lease documents to justify using Abigail's land. They had created fake contracts dated 2007, claiming Abigail had rented the properties to them for a symbolic amount. Mr. Sterling found inconsistencies in the forged documents that would be easily detectable by an expert. The signatures were clearly fake, the dates didn't match other official records, and there were basic errors in legal language that no legitimate document would have. "They are criminals, but they are not smart criminals," Mr. Sterling commented. "These fake documents are so poorly made, they will only make their situation worse." 3 days before the hearing, something happened that no one expected. Mrs. Beatrice sought out Eleanor secretly and asked to speak with Abigail. "I know I have no right to ask this," Beatrice said with tears in her eyes, "but I need to speak with her. I need to ask for forgiveness for what my family did." Eleanor hesitated. Technically, Beatrice was violating the protective order by seeking contact with Abigail. But there was something genuine in her desperation that made her reconsider. "I will ask Mrs. Abigail if she wants to speak with you. But if she says no, you will have to respect that." To Eleanor's surprise, Abigail agreed to receive Beatrice. The meeting took place in the living room of Eleanor's house, with Mr. Sterling present as a witness to ensure nothing inappropriate was said. Beatrice entered the room like a defeated woman. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled, and there were deep, dark circles under her eyes. "Abigail," she said, barely able to look directly at the woman her family had enslaved, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I didn't know everything." "What did you know?" asked Abigail with a calm but firm voice. "I knew that Silas had said you abandoned your land and that he decided to use it, but I didn't know that he had planned everything since the accident." "Did you know I worked without pay?" asked Abigail. "I knew," admitted Beatrice, lowering her head. "Did you know I slept in a shed, that I ate scraps, that I was treated worse than the animals?" "I knew," repeated Beatrice, crying. "Then you knew everything that mattered," concluded Abigail. The simplicity of the response was more devastating than any shout or accusation could have been. Beatrice realized there were no mitigating factors for 16 years of silent complicity. "What do you want from me now?" asked Abigail. "I want you to know that I will testify in your favor at the hearing," said Beatrice. "I will tell the whole truth about what my family did." The statement surprised everyone in the room. Mr. Sterling immediately realized this would completely change the dynamics of the case. "Mrs. Beatrice, do you understand this could result in criminal consequences for your family?" he asked. "I understand, but I can't live with this guilt anymore." 16 years was far too long. Abigail looked at Beatrice for a long time before answering. "I accept your apology," she finally said, "not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free of the hatred I was carrying." Abigail's generosity made Beatrice cry even harder. Even after all she had suffered, she was still capable of compassion. "Thank you," whispered Beatrice. "Thank you for being a better person than any of us deserved." Beatrice left Eleanor's house and went straight home to tell Silas about her decision to testify in Abigail's favor. His reaction was violent. He shouted, threatened, even raised his hand to strike his wife. But Beatrice remained firm in her decision. "I will no longer be an accomplice to this crime," she said. 16 years of silence were enough. "You will destroy our family," shouted Silas. "Our family was destroyed the day you brought that woman here and decided to steal everything from her," replied Beatrice. "I am only admitting a truth we always knew." On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse in the nearest town was packed. The story had spread throughout the rural county, and people had come from far away to witness the outcome of the most talked-about case in recent years. Abigail entered the courtroom accompanied by Eleanor and Mr. Sterling. She wore a simple but dignified dress that Eleanor had bought for her, and she walked upright, with her head held high. It was hard to recognize in her the hunched, submissive woman who had worked as a slave for 16 years. The Harrisons arrived with Mr. Blackwell and a team of legal assistants. Silas avoided looking directly at Abigail, but she could feel the hatred emanating from him. Judge William Vance opened the session and immediately established the seriousness of the case. We are here to judge serious accusations of embezzlement, false imprisonment, and exploitation of labor akin to slavery, he said. I want everyone present to understand that this court will take the facts very seriously, regardless of who is involved. Mr. Sterling first presented Abigail's case. He showed the original documents, the medical reports, and called the witnesses who confirmed her identity and her status as the legitimate owner of the lands in question. The most impactful moment was when Abigail was called to testify. She stood calmly, walked to the witness chair, and took the oath with a firm voice. Mr. Sterling guided her through questions about her life before the accident, her recovered memories, and the 16 years of exploitation. Abigail answered each question with clarity and dignity, never showing anger or vengeance, only telling the facts as they had happened. Mrs. Abigail, asked Mr. Sterling, during these 16 years, did you ever receive a wage for your work? Never. Did you have the freedom to leave the property whenever you wished? No. Especially in recent times, I was locked in the shed at night. How would you describe your living conditions? I slept on a mattress on the floor of a windowless shed, with no private bathroom, no heating in winter, and no ventilation in summer. And your food? I ate the leftovers from the Harrison family's table. Each of Abigail's answers created a tense silence in the courtroom. The people present shook their heads. Some cried, others murmured indignantly. When it was Mr. Blackwell's turn to question Abigail, he tried to use the strategy he had planned. Mrs. Abigail, don't you find it strange that you recovered these memories precisely now, after 16 years? I don't find it strange, she replied calmly. I always had fragments of memory. What changed was that someone finally helped me organize those fragments and understand what they meant. But do you admit that for 16 years you didn't remember being the owner of this land? I admit that for 16 years I was prevented from having access to the information and support I needed to understand my situation. Abigail's response was so precise that Mr. Blackwell realized his strategy wasn't working. She didn't seem confused or incapable. On the contrary, her answers showed impressive lucidity. Mr. Blackwell tried a different approach. Mrs. Abigail, during those 16 years, couldn't you have sought help if you really wanted to? Abigail looked directly at him before answering. Doctor, when a person suffers a head trauma and loses part of their memory, when they are isolated from any contact with the outside world, when they are psychologically manipulated every day to believe they are worthless and have no rights, it is very difficult to seek help, especially when the people who should help are exactly the ones benefiting from your vulnerability. Abigail's answer echoed through the courtroom like a punch to the gut. Some people in the audience began to applaud, but the judge called for silence. The most dramatic moment of the hearing arrived when Beatrice was called to testify. Silas looked at his wife with a mixture of anger and despair, knowing she was about to destroy any chance of defense they might have. Beatrice took the oath with trembling hands and a weak voice. Mr. Sterling questioned her about her knowledge of the facts. Mrs. Beatrice, do you confirm that Abigail Miller worked on your family's property without receiving a salary? I confirm. Did you know she slept in a shed in poor conditions? I knew. Did you know that the properties where your family lived and worked were registered in the name of Abigail Miller? Beatrice hesitated for a moment, looked at Silas and then answered, I knew there were papers in her name. Silas always said they were old documents, worthless, from when she had lived in the county before. But deep in my heart, I always knew that wasn't right. Are you aware of how Abigail came to your property after the 2007 accident? Yes, I am. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the judge leaned forward to hear better. Can you tell us? Beatrice took a deep breath and told the full version of the facts for the first time in 16 years. Silas had learned of Abigail's husband's death and had been interested in her lands for some time. On the day of the accident, he wasn't at home, as he said. He had followed her car down the road. When the accident happened, he was the first to arrive at the scene. Instead of calling for rescue, he brought Abigail to our house and decided to take advantage of the situation. Take advantage how? During the first weeks, While she was recovering from her injuries but couldn't remember things properly, Silas hid all her documents, spread the story that she was a poor worker with no family, and gradually convinced her that she had nowhere else to go. Beatrice's testimony was like a bomb exploding in the courtroom. People in the audience murmured indignantly, and Silas tried to stand up to protest, but was restrained by security guards. Mr. Blackwell tried to minimize the impact of Beatrice's testimony, arguing that she was lying to harm her own husband, but his argument sounded desperate and unconvincing. When it was Silas's turn to testify, he stuck to his original version, denying all accusations and claiming that Abigail had shown up asking for work and that they had been generous in taking her in. But his testimony was contradictory on several points, and he was clearly nervous and lying. The contrast between his defensive and aggressive posture and Abigail's calm dignity was remarkable to all present. The most tense moment came when Mr. Sterling questioned Silas directly about the forged documents. "Mr. Silas, can you explain how these supposed powers of attorney and lease agreements were created?" "They are legitimate," insisted Silas. "Then can you explain why Abigail Miller's signature on these documents is completely different from her signature on the original documents from 1995 to 2003? Mr. Sterling showed a side-by-side comparison of the signatures. The difference was obvious even to laypeople. The signatures on the forged documents were clearly unsuccessful attempts to imitate Abigail's true handwriting. Silas was left speechless. His defense was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Judge William Vance adjourned the hearing and said he would give his decision the following week, after analyzing all the evidence presented. During the week of waiting, the tension in the county was palpable. Everyone knew the judge's decision would completely change several people's lives. Abigail spent those days torn between hope and anxiety. She knew the evidence was in her favor, but 16 years of oppression had taught her not to trust anything fully. Eleanor noticed that Abigail spent hours looking out the window toward the mountains where her properties were. "What are you thinking about?" Eleanor asked on one such occasion. "I'm thinking about what it will be like to go back home," Abigail replied. 16 years is a long time. I don't even know if I'll remember how it feels to be the owner of my own life." "You will remember," Eleanor said confidently. "Some things are never completely forgotten." On the following Monday morning, the courthouse was even more crowded than the previous week. Judge William Vance's decision would be definitive in determining the future of everyone involved. The judge entered the room with a serious expression and began to read his decision. After carefully examining all the evidence presented, hearing the testimonies of the involved parties and witnesses, and analyzing the technical reports, this court has reached the following conclusions. First, the identity of Abigail Miller as the legitimate owner of the 3 rural properties in question is proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. Second, it is proven that the Harrison family wrongfully appropriated these properties after the claimant's accident in March 2007. Third, it is proven that Abigail Miller was kept in conditions analogous to slavery for 16 years, deprived of freedom, dignity, and the fruits of her own labor. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Abigail felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they were tears of relief and justice. The judge continued, "Therefore this court orders, first, the immediate restitution of all properties to Abigail Miller, including improvements, animals, equipment, and all movable and immovable property present on the lands. Second, the payment of compensation for moral damages in the amount of $500,000. Third, the payment of back wages for the 16 years of unpaid work, calculated at current market value. Fourth, the defendants Silas Harrison and Beatrice Harrison are sentenced to pay a fine for labor analogous to slavery and must face criminal charges for the crimes committed." The decision was met with applause from the audience. Abigail was crying, but they were tears of happiness and relief. After 16 years of injustice, she had finally recovered not only her properties, but her dignity. Silas left the courtroom in a fury, promising to appeal the decision, but his lawyers had already told him the chances of overturning the verdict were minimal. Beatrice approached Abigail before leaving the courthouse. "Thank you for forgiving me," she said, "and I'm sorry it took me so many years to do the right thing." Abigail simply nodded. The forgiveness had been given, but that didn't mean the consequences of the crimes would be erased. 2 weeks later, Abigail stepped onto her property as the rightful owner for the first time in 16 years. Eleanor accompanied her, as did Mr. Sterling and a court officer, to ensure the restitution was carried out properly. The manor house was empty. The Harrisons had left the day before, taking only personal belongings. Everything else, furniture, equipment, even the clothes Abigail had washed so many times, remained on the property. Abigail walked slowly through the rooms of the house where she had been humiliated daily. Now every room, every piece of furniture, every object was rightfully hers. She stopped in the kitchen where she had eaten leftovers for so many years, and then walked out to the porch where Silas used to shout his orders. The silence was deep and liberating. "How do you feel?" asked Eleanor. "Strange," Abigail answered honestly. "For 16 years I dreamed of this moment. Now that it's here, it's hard to believe it's real." They walked to the shed where Abigail had lived. The structure seemed even smaller and more miserable now that she saw it through the eyes of an owner, not a prisoner. "What do you want to do with this place?" asked Mr. Sterling. "I'm going to tear it down," said Abigail without hesitation, "and in its place I will build a school, so that other people can learn to read and never go through what I went through for not knowing how to defend my own rights." The idea of transforming the symbol of her oppression into a place of education and liberation deeply touched everyone present. In the weeks that followed, Abigail dedicated herself to getting to know her properties again. She discovered that the Harrisons had significantly expanded production over the years, using the profits from the land to invest in more equipment and improvements. Ironically, Abigail's work as a slave had been so efficient that her own properties were more valuable and productive than when she had lost them. The financial compensation allowed her to hire workers to help with the farm work. But this time, everyone received fair wages, had decent houses to live in, and were treated with dignity and respect. The first person Abigail hired was Robert, the mechanic who had helped with the secret communication with Eleanor. The second was Mrs. Daisy, who needed work in her old age and was hired as the manager of the manor house. Eleanor visited daily and watched Abigail's remarkable transformation. The stooped, submissive woman had completely disappeared, replaced by a confident and generous landowner. "Do you know what the most important day of my life was?" Abigail said to Eleanor one afternoon as they drank tea on the manor house porch. "Which one?" "The day you decided to help me. Without you, I would have died in that shed without ever knowing who I really was." "You would have found out somehow," said Eleanor. "The truth always finds a way to come out." "Perhaps. But you made the difference between discovering the truth at 70 or dying at 68 without ever knowing." 6 months after the court decision, Abigail organized a big celebration on her land. She invited all the neighbors, all the people who had helped her, and even some who hadn't helped but regretted their silence. The celebration took place exactly on the spot where the shed she had been held prisoner in once stood. In place of the miserable structure, there was now a garden of colorful flowers and a small school under construction. During the festival, Abigail gave a speech that was remembered in the county for many years. "My friends, for 16 years I lived as if I were nothing, as if I were worth nothing, as if I deserved nothing. Today I know that every person is worth a great deal, deserves respect, and has the right to know the truth about their own life. I am not here today to celebrate revenge against those who wronged me. I am here to celebrate that the truth has prevailed, that justice exists, and that it is never too late to reclaim our dignity. I want to thank especially the teacher Eleanor, who taught me that I had rights when I had forgotten they existed. And I want to say to anyone suffering injustice, do not give up. The truth may take time to appear, but it always appears." Abigail's speech was applauded for over 10 minutes. Many people were crying, including some who had witnessed her exploitation for years without intervening. Beatrice was among the guests. She had separated from Silas after the trial and was trying to rebuild her life. She approached Abigail at the end of the festival. "Thank you for inviting me," she said. "I wasn't sure if I would be welcome." "Everyone who acknowledges their mistakes and wants change is welcome here," Abigail replied. "You are a better person than any of us deserved," said Beatrice, echoing her words from months before. "I am no better than anyone," said Abigail. "I just learned that carrying hatred in your heart hurts the one who carries it more than the one the hatred is directed at." 1 year after the court decision, the school on the site of the old shed was inaugurated. Abigail had invested part of her compensation to create a literacy center for adults in the county. The first class had 20 students, mostly elderly people who had never had the opportunity to study. Abigail was often seen in the classrooms, not as a teacher, but as an older student, learning alongside the others. "Why do you still study?" asked one of the younger students. "You already know how to read now." "Because for 16 years I couldn't learn anything new," Abigail replied. "Now I want to recover all that lost time." Eleanor had become the school's principal, a role she performed with passion and dedication. Seeing adults discover the power of letters and numbers moved her as deeply as helping Abigail had. Mr. Sterling had officially returned to practicing law to accept other cases of social injustice. The victory in Abigail's case had rekindled his passion for defending the oppressed. "Your case changed my life too," he told Abigail during one of his visits. "It reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Silas had exhausted all his legal appeals and was sentenced to 3 years in prison for labor, analogous to slavery. Caleb and Jacob sold their houses in the city to pay the owed compensation, but they were not criminally convicted as they had no direct involvement in the initial crime. Abigail's story spread far beyond the county. Newspapers from big cities published reports about the case, and she received invitations to speak about human rights and overcoming adversity. But Abigail preferred the simplicity of her new life. She woke up early, tended to her land, visited the school, had friends over for lunch, and slept in her own bed every night. 2 years after recovering her properties, Abigail received an unexpected visit. A man of about 50 appeared at her door, saying he was the nephew of her late husband, Samuel Miller. "Aunt Abigail, I searched for you for years after the accident," he said with tears in his eyes. "The police said you had disappeared. I never imagined you were so close being exploited by those criminals." The meeting with Benjamin, the son of Samuel's brother, brought more memories back to Abigail. She remembered family events, a network of relationships she thought she had lost forever. "Why did you stop looking for me?" she asked. "I never stopped completely," Benjamin replied, "but after a few years without any leads, the lawyers told me you had probably died in the accident and your body was never found. I wanted to believe you were alive somewhere, but it was easier to believe I was dead than to keep looking," Abigail finished, without bitterness in her voice. "Forgive me, Aunt. I should have searched harder. Do you forgive me for disappearing from your lives without explanation? But you didn't disappear by choice. You were the victim of a crime. And you gave up searching because you lost hope, not because you stopped caring. We both did the best we could with the information we had at the time." Abigail's capacity for forgiveness and understanding continued to surprise everyone around her. She had learned during her years of suffering that blaming people for not being perfect was a waste of energy. Benjamin became a regular visitor, bringing news about other relatives who thought Abigail had died. Gradually, she rebuilt the family ties she had lost. At her 70th birthday party, 3 years after regaining her freedom, Abigail was surrounded by over 100 people. There was rediscovered family, neighbors, employees, former students from the literacy school, and friends she had made in her new life. Eleanor gave a moving speech about how meeting Abigail had changed her perspective on courage and perseverance. "Mrs. Abigail taught me that true strength isn't about never falling," she said, "but about getting back up after being knocked down and still keeping the ability to love, forgive, and help others." Abigail responded to Eleanor's speech with words that summed up her journey. "My dear friends, for a long time I believed my life ended at 52 on the day of the accident. Today I know my real life began at 68, on the day a young, brave teacher helped me discover who I really was. I learned that it's never too late to start over, never too late to discover the truth, and never too late to be happy. I also learned that the greatest wealth isn't the land we own or the money we earn, but the people who choose to stand by our side when we need them. It took 16 years of darkness for me to value every minute of light. It took 16 years of forced silence for me to value every word I can speak freely. It took 16 years of humiliation for me to understand the true value of dignity. I don't wish the suffering I endured on anyone, but I am grateful I survived it, because it made me a stronger person and more able to help others who are going through hardships. The speech was interrupted several times by applause, and some people couldn't hold back their tears. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. 5 years after the trial, the literacy school had expanded to include vocational courses and a free legal assistance program for rural workers. Abigail had used much of her compensation to create a foundation that helped people in situations of labor exploitation. Eleanor had married Mr. Sterling in a simple ceremony held at Abigail's property. The couple lived in a house that Abigail had built especially for them on the land, and they continued to manage the social projects together. "You two are the family I chose," said Abigail on their wedding day. "Samuel and I could never have children, but now I have the best children a mother could want." The bond between Abigail, Eleanor, and Sterling had transformed into an unconventional but deeply united family. They dined together several times a week, celebrated holidays together, and supported each other in all important decisions. Abigail had also become a sort of matriarch in the rural county. People with legal troubles, family disputes, or financial difficulties often sought her advice. She would listen patiently to each situation and offer both practical wisdom and emotional support. "Why do people trust you so much?" Eleanor asked on one such occasion. "Because they know I understand what it is to suffer," Abigail replied. "And they know that if I manage to escape suffering and find peace, perhaps they can too." One of the most notable cases Abigail helped resolve was that of Lillian, a 40-year-old woman who was being exploited by a family in the neighboring town under conditions similar to those she herself had lived through. Lillian had worked as a maid for the same family for 15 years, living in a small back room, working 7 days a week, and receiving only basic food and used clothes as payment. When the story reached Abigail's ears through the network of contacts she had developed, she did not hesitate to act. "We are going to help this woman," she said to Eleanor and Sterling. "I cannot allow someone to go through what I went through when I have the power to stop it." Lillian's case was more straightforward than Abigail's because there was more awareness about labor rights, and Abigail already had experience dealing with similar situations. In less than 2 months, Lillian was free, had received all due labor rights, and was living in a small house that Abigail had rented for her until she could get on her feet financially. "Why are you doing this for me?" Lillian asked when Abigail showed up with furniture and appliances for the new house. "Because someone did the same for me when I needed it," Abigail answered, "and because everyone deserves a second chance to be happy." Lillian became an employee of Abigail's foundation, specializing in identifying and helping other people in situations of labor exploitation. Her personal experience made her particularly effective at gaining the trust of victims who were afraid to report their exploiters. "Lillian is my successor," Abigail would say to anyone who would listen. "She will continue this work when I no longer can." At 75, Abigail remained active and healthy, but she had begun to think about the legacy she wanted to leave. She had written her memoirs with Eleanor's help, and the book was being prepared for publication. "I want my story to serve as an example for others," she explained. "I want them to know it's never too late to reclaim lost dignity." The book, titled "It's Never Too Late to Start Over," the story of a woman who reclaimed her life at 68, would become a regional bestseller and inspire the creation of stricter laws against labor exploitation. One of the most impactful parts of the book was the chapter where Abigail described her feelings during the first days after regaining her freedom. "For 16 years, I had forgotten what it was like to make a decision for myself. Simple things like choosing what clothes to wear or what food to eat became exercises in freedom. I would stand in front of the wardrobe for minutes, amazed that no one was going to yell at me regardless of the choice I made. The first time I slept in a real bed after 16 years of sleeping on the floor, I cried, not from sadness, but from the pure joy of rediscovering what basic comfort meant. The first time I ate at a set table, with clean plates and hot food, I had to go outside and vomit because my body had grown unaccustomed to quality food. But the most emotional moment was when I realized I could say no. For 16 years I had not said no to anything, to anyone, to any situation. When Eleanor asked me if I wanted sugar in my coffee and I answered no, thank you, I realized I had regained a fundamental part of my humanity, the capacity for choice. At 78, Abigail was invited to speak at the National Congress about human rights and labor exploitation. It was the first time she had left her home county since the accident, 19 years prior. "I'm nervous," she confessed to Eleanor at the airport. "I've never spoken to so many important people before." "You've spoken to audiences of hundreds of people here in the county," Eleanor reminded her. "Yes, but they were people who know me. These people will only see me as an old woman who went through something terrible." "They will see you as a survivor who became an advocate for other victims," Eleanor corrected. "They will see you as the courageous person you are." Abigail's speech at the Congress was televised and watched by millions. She spoke for 40 minutes about her experience, the importance of stricter laws against labor exploitation, and the need for support networks for victims. "Congressman," she said at one point, "I am not here asking for anyone's pity. I am here asking for action. Right now, somewhere in our country, there is a woman being exploited as I was, a man being humiliated as I was, a person losing their dignity as I lost mine. Our collective responsibility is to ensure these people have access to justice much faster than I did." The speech resulted in the approval of a law that became known as the Abigail Miller Act, which established stricter penalties for labor exploitation and created more effective protection mechanisms for victims. Abigail returned home as a national heroine, but remained humble and focused on her local work. "Laws are important," she said in an interview, "but what really changes people's lives are other people willing to help. I wasn't saved by a law, but by a teacher who decided my life was worth saving." At 80, Abigail decided it was time to pass the daily administration of her properties to younger people. Eleanor and Sterling took over the financial management, Lillian took over the Labor Rights Foundation, and Benjamin, Samuel's nephew, took over the agricultural administration. "I am not retiring," she clarified at a family meeting. "I am merely changing my role from executor to advisor." Abigail maintained an active but more relaxed routine. She spent her mornings in the garden she had planted on the site of the old shed, her afternoons reading in the school library, and her evenings receiving visits from people seeking her advice. One of her favorite activities was telling stories to the school children. She adapted her own experience into versions appropriate for different ages, always emphasizing the lessons of perseverance, kindness, and justice. Grandma Abigail, an 8-year-old girl, asked during one of these sessions, "How did you manage to forgive the bad people who did terrible things to you?" "You know, dear," Abigail replied, "I discovered that when we hold anger in our hearts for too long, it grows heavy and hurts us more than the person we're angry with. Forgiving doesn't mean saying what they did was right. Forgiving means deciding you won't carry that weight anymore." "But don't you ever feel sad remembering the bad things?" "I do. But I also feel happy remembering all the good things that happened afterward. And most of all, I feel happy knowing I used my bad experience to help other people have good experiences." These conversations with children became some of the most precious memories of Abigail's final years. She saw in their eyes the purity and hope she had kept alive within herself during the darkest years. Abigail Miller passed away peacefully at the age of 85 on a sunny spring morning, sitting in her favorite chair in the garden she had built, where the shed of her imprisonment once stood. She was surrounded by colorful flowers and the sound of children playing at the nearby school. Eleanor found her body a few hours later, when she came to bring lunch as she did every day. In Abigail's hands was a letter she had written the night before. "My dear children of the heart, Eleanor, Sterling, and Daisy, if you are reading this letter, it means my time to depart has come. Do not be sad, for I have had a full and happy life. It is true that I lost 16 years, but I gained 17 years of freedom, love, and purpose. I want you to know that every day since I regained my dignity was a gift. Every friendship I built, every person I helped, every moment of peace I lived was a victory against those who tried to make me believe I was worthless. My greatest pride is not the properties I recovered or the money I earned. My greatest pride is the people you have become and all the other people we managed to help together. Continue the work we began. There are many people out there who need to discover they are worth more than they think, that they deserve more than they are getting, that they have rights even when they don't know what they are. And always remember, it is never too late to start over, it is never too late to find happiness, and it is never too late to make a difference in someone's life. Thank you for helping me discover that life can be beautiful, even after the darkest moments. With all my love and gratitude, Abigail Miller P.S. Plant more flowers in the garden. It never has too many. Abigail's funeral was one of the largest ever seen in the county. Hundreds of people came to pay their last respects to the woman who had become a symbol of resilience, overcoming, and generosity. The procession passed by all the significant places of her journey: the school she had built, the manor house where she had regained her dignity, and finally arrived at the cemetery where Samuel Miller had been buried 24 years earlier. Abigail's grave was placed next to Samuel's, finally reuniting the couple that death and human cruelty had separated. On the headstone, Eleanor had the words that summarized Abigail's life philosophy engraved: "It is never too late to start over." During the wake, dozens of people told stories about how Abigail had impacted their lives. Lillian spoke about how she had given her a second chance. Benjamin spoke about how she had forgiven him for giving up the search for her. Mr. Sterling spoke about how she had inspired him to return to fighting for justice. But it was Eleanor's speech that moved those present the most. Mrs. Abigail taught me that heroism isn't about doing extraordinary things. Heroism is about maintaining humanity in inhumane circumstances. It's about choosing forgiveness when you have every right to hold a grudge. It's about using your own suffering to lessen the suffering of others. She lived 16 years as a slave, but died as the freest woman I ever knew. She lived years being treated as if she were worthless, but died knowing she had been worth everything to hundreds of people she helped. The true measure of a life is not how many years we live, but how many lives we touch. And Mrs. Abigail touched all of our lives in a way we will never forget. 1 year after Abigail's death, the foundation she had created was renamed the Abigail Miller Foundation for Labor Dignity. The organization had grown and now operated in 3 states, helping hundreds of people each year. Eleanor had become the foundation's president and continued living on the property Abigail had left her. Sterling managed the legal aspects, and Lillian coordinated the direct work with victims. The literacy school had also grown and now offered courses through high school. Dozens of adults graduated each year, many of them going to universities with scholarships sponsored by the foundation. The garden where Abigail used to sit had become a memorial visited by people from all over the country. The flowers, planted according to her final request, bloomed year-round, creating a spectacle of color that seemed to celebrate life, even in the place that had once symbolized suffering. 5 years after her death, Abigail's story was made into a film that achieved national success. The actress who portrayed her visited the region to meet the people who had known Abigail personally. "How would you like her to be remembered?" the actress asked during a press conference. "As an ordinary woman who did extraordinary things," replied Eleanor, "as someone who proved that human dignity cannot be stolen, only temporarily hidden. As a person who turned her greatest weakness into her greatest strength," added Lillian. "She used her experience of suffering to become an expert in healing the suffering of others. As a grandmother who taught all of us that it's never too late for anything," concluded Benjamin. "It's never too late to start over, never too late to forgive, never too late to be happy." The property where Abigail had lived her final years became an education center for labor rights. The manor house was turned into a museum, and visitors could see exactly how she had lived as a slave and how she had rebuilt her life as an owner. The room where she had slept during her last 17 years was preserved exactly as she left it, simple but comfortable, with a view of the flower garden and the school where so many people had learned to read. On the nightstand, A photo of her with Eleanor, Sterling, and Lillian during her last birthday party showed the radiant smile of a woman who had found peace after a long and difficult journey. 10 years after Abigail's death, the National Congress passed a constitutional amendment that became known as the Abigail Miller Amendment, which made labor analogous to slavery a heinous crime with much harsher penalties. At the amendment's enactment ceremony, Eleanor was invited to speak on behalf of Abigail's memory. "Mrs. Abigail is no longer here to see this achievement, but I know she would be happy to know that her terrible experience is helping prevent others from going through the same suffering. This amendment does not bring Mrs. Abigail back. It does not undo the 16 years that were stolen from her. It does not erase the pain she felt, but it ensures that her sacrifice was not in vain, that her story will continue protecting people long after all of us are gone." Mrs. Abigail always said that the greatest gift we can give someone is to help them discover their own worth. This amendment is our way of helping all of Brazil discover that every worker has value, every human being has dignity, and every person deserves to be treated with respect. 15 years after Abigail's death, Lillian, now a 55-year-old woman, was invited to give a lecture on labor rights at a university in the capital. During the lecture, a student asked, "Do you think cases like Abigail Miller's still happen today?" Lillian answered with the wisdom she had learned from Abigail, "Unfortunately, yes. The form may change, but human exploitation still exists. That's why the work we do is so important. That's why we need to remain vigilant, to keep educating, to keep protecting each other. Mrs. Abigail taught me that every person has the responsibility to care for the people around them. She used to say, if you see someone being mistreated and do nothing, you become part of the problem. So, my message to you young people is this: keep your eyes open, your heart compassionate, and your courage ready to act when you see injustice. You can be the difference between someone continuing to suffer and someone regaining their dignity." 20 years after Abigail's death, Eleanor, now 65, wrote a second book about her, titled The Legacy of Abigail 20 Years Later. In the book, Eleanor reflected on the lasting impact Abigail had had on the region and the country. Abigail Miller was an ordinary woman who lived an extraordinary experience of suffering and overcoming. But what made her truly special was not what happened to her, but what she did with what happened to her. She could have emerged from her 16 years of captivity full of bitterness and a desire for revenge. Instead, she emerged full of compassion and a desire to serve. She could have used her story to gain pity and sympathy. Instead, she used it to inspire courage and action. In the 20 years since her death, more than 1,000 people have been freed from situations of labor exploitation, thanks to the work of the foundation she created. More than 5,000 adults learned to read at the school she built. Hundreds of families received free legal assistance through the programs she established. But her greatest legacy is not the numbers of people helped. Her greatest legacy is the living proof that human dignity is indestructible, that compassion is stronger than cruelty, and that it is never, ever too late to start over. Eleanor's book became required reading in schools across the country, ensuring that new generations would know Abigail's story and learn its lessons. Today, 30 years after the day Eleanor decided to help an elderly woman selling vegetables at a market, the property of Abigail Miller continues to be a center of education, social justice, and hope. The garden where she liked to sit has bloomed for 3 consecutive decades, the flowers renewing themselves each spring as a symbol that life always finds a way to begin again. The school she built on the site of her former captivity has now graduated over 10,000 adult students, many of whom have become teachers, lawyers, social workers, and other professionals dedicated to helping people in vulnerable situations. The foundation she created is now one of the largest labor rights organizations in the country, with offices in every state capital and a network of thousands of volunteers. And the most important lesson she left behind continues to be passed from person to person, from generation to generation, that no matter how terrible our current situation may be, there is always hope for a better future, that no matter how lost we may feel, there are always people willing to help us find our way, and that no matter our age or circumstances, it is never too late to discover our own worth, reclaim our dignity, and begin our life anew. The story of Abigail Miller is not just the story of a woman who was exploited and managed to free herself. It is the story of a community that learned to take better care of each other, of a country that decided to better protect its most vulnerable citizens, and of the eternal proof that a single act of kindness can change not just one life, but the entire world around that life. Where once there stood a miserable shed where a woman was kept as a slave, today there is a flower garden where children play and adults learn. Where once there was complicit silence in the face of injustice, today there are courageous voices that rise to defend the oppressed. Where once there was hopeless despair, today there is the certainty that every person has value, every life has purpose, and every story can have a dignified and beautiful ending. And so the girl who once asked Abigail how to forgive bad people, now grown and a teacher at the school Abigail built, tells her own students the story of the extraordinary woman who proved that it is never too late for anything, especially to be happy. End of story. This was a fictional story created to touch our hearts. Now tell us what you thought. Which part of Abigail's journey moved you the most? Leave your comment and share your reflections on this story of overcoming.